Ben Shapiro thought he could steamroll Jasmine Crockett with rapid-fire talking points and logical fallacies. What happened next destroyed his reputation as a master debater and exposed the intellectual fraud he'd been peddling for years. The debate hall at UCLA was packed beyond capacity, with students sitting in aisles and standing along the walls. The university's political science department had organized what they called the Great Policy Debate, a discussion on healthcare reform between two of the most talked-about figures in American politics. Ben Shapiro sat on the left side of the stage, adjusting his microphone with the confidence of someone who'd never lost a college debate. His Harvard law degree was prominently displayed in his bio, along with his reputation for destroying liberals with facts and logic. Representative Jasmine Crockett sat across from him, wearing a burgundy blazer and carrying her signature leather portfolio. She'd agreed to the debate reluctantly. Her staff had warned her that Shapiro's style was more performance than substance, designed to generate viral clips rather than meaningful policy discussion. But she'd spent too many years as a public defender dealing with fast-talking lawyers to be intimidated by someone whose primary skill was speaking quickly. The moderator, a UCLA professor named Dr. Sarah Chen, laid out the ground rules. Tonight's topic is healthcare reform. Each participant will have 5 minutes for opening statements, followed by structured debate and audience Q&A. Mr. Shapiro, you'll go first. Shapiro launched into his trademark rapid-fire delivery, his words tumbling over each other like water from a broken dam. Ladies and gentlemen, the facts are clear. Government-run healthcare is an economic disaster waiting to happen. Look at the Veterans Affairs system, plagued by scandals, inefficiency, and substandard care. Look at Medicare, projected to be insolvent by 2026. Look at Medicaid, a bloated bureaucracy that provides inferior care while bankrupting state budgets. He gestured dramatically, his voice rising. The free market has given us the most advanced medical technology in human history. Americans have access to treatments and procedures that people in socialist countries can only dream of. When the government gets involved, innovation dies, quality suffers, and costs skyrocket. These are facts, not feelings, he concluded with his signature smirk. My opponent will probably tell you heartwarming stories about people who need help, but policy isn't made on emotions. It's made on data, economics, and constitutional principles. And the data is clear. Government healthcare is a recipe for disaster. The audience applauded politely. Shapiro sat back in his chair, looking satisfied with his performance. He'd hit all his talking points, cited statistics, and established his intellectual authority. This was going to be easier than he'd expected. Crockett stood up, slowly walked to the podium, and opened her portfolio. She didn't speak immediately, just stood there for a moment, letting the silence build. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, measured, almost conversational. Ben just gave us a perfect example of what I call data without context. Throwing around statistics and buzzwords without actually understanding what they mean or how they connect to real people's lives. She looked directly at him. But before we get into policy details, I have a simple question for you, Ben. Shapiro leaned forward, slightly ready for whatever challenge she was about to present. What's the deductible on your health insurance? The question hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Shapiro's confident expression flickered for just a moment. I'm sorry, what does that have to do with? It's a simple question, Crockett interrupted gently. You've spent the last 5 minutes lecturing us about healthcare economics. You've told us that the free market system works great. So I'm asking, what's your deductible? How much do you pay out of pocket before your insurance kicks in? Shapiro shifted in his chair. I don't see how my personal insurance situation is relevant to policy discussion. It's completely relevant, Crockett replied, her voice still calm but carrying more weight now. Because you're sitting here telling people that our current system works fine, that government involvement would make things worse. But if you don't even know what ordinary Americans face when they try to use their insurance, how can you possibly make informed policy recommendations? She walked closer to his side of the stage. Let me help you out, Ben. The average deductible for an individual health insurance plan in America is $300. For families, it's over $8,000. That means most people have to spend thousands of dollars out of their own pocket before their insurance pays for anything. The audience was completely silent now, hanging on every word. But you don't know that, do you, Ben? Because you've probably never had to worry about whether you can afford to go to the doctor. You've probably never had to choose between filling a prescription and paying rent. You've probably never had to set up a GoFundMe to pay for your child's medical treatment. Shapiro tried to regain control. Look, personal anecdotes don't change economic realities. This isn't a personal anecdote. Crockett cut him off. This is the economic reality that 67% of American families face every day. But you wouldn't know that because you spent your entire career talking about healthcare policy without ever actually experiencing the healthcare system that most Americans deal with. She pulled out a sheet of paper. Ben, you make approximately $1 million per year from your media company. Your wife is a doctor. I'm guessing your family's health insurance is pretty comprehensive, probably with a low deductible and excellent coverage. Am I wrong? Shapiro's face was starting to flush. My personal financial situation isn't. It's completely relevant, Crockett insisted, because you're asking people to trust your judgment about a system you've never actually had to navigate. You're like a food critic who's never been hungry trying to tell people that stale bread is perfectly fine. She turned to address the audience directly. This is the problem with so much of our political discourse. People with privilege and resources making policy recommendations for people whose experiences they've never shared and whose struggles they've never faced. She walked back to the podium and pulled out another document. Ben mentioned the VA system as an example of government healthcare failure. But here's what he didn't tell you. Veterans who use VA healthcare report higher satisfaction rates than people with private insurance. The VA consistently outperforms private hospitals on quality metrics. And veterans who lose access to VA care because of eligibility changes see their mortality rates increase significantly. Shapiro tried to interrupt, but Crockett kept going. He mentioned Medicare being insolvent by 2026, but he didn't mention that Medicare operates with administrative costs of less than 2%, while private insurance companies have administrative costs averaging 15 to 20%. He didn't mention that Medicare recipients report higher satisfaction than people with private insurance. He didn't mention that every other developed country in the world provides universal health care at a fraction of what we spend. She looked directly at him again. But here's what really bothers me about your approach, Ben. You use big words and rapid-fire delivery to make yourself sound smart, but you're actually making arguments that would collapse under basic scrutiny if you slowed down long enough for people to think about them. The audience was completely captivated now. This wasn't the usual political theater they'd expected. This was a systematic dismantling of everything Shapiro claimed to represent. You say the free market has given us the most advanced medical technology in human history, but most of that technology was developed through government-funded research at universities and the National Institutes of Health. The internet that allows you to spread your opinions, government-funded research. The GPS in your phone, government-funded research. The touchscreen technology, government-funded research. She pulled out her phone and held it up. This device exists because of decades of collective investment in basic research, much of it funded by taxpayers. But you want to give all the credit to private companies that assembled existing technologies into consumer products. Shapiro was looking increasingly uncomfortable, his usual rapid-fire confidence nowhere to be found. And let's talk about constitutional principles since you mentioned them, Crockett continued. The Constitution's preamble says the government exists to promote the general welfare. What could be more fundamental to general welfare than ensuring people can get medical care when they're sick? She walked closer to him again. But you've never had to worry about that, have you, Ben? You've never had to ration insulin because you can't afford it. You've never had to choose between chemotherapy and bankruptcy. You've never had to watch a family member die from a treatable condition because they couldn't afford treatment. The room was so quiet you could hear people breathing. So here's my question for you, Ben. And this time, I want a real answer, not a deflection. If our current healthcare system is so great, if government involvement would make things worse, why do we spend twice as much per capita on healthcare as any other developed country while getting worse outcomes? Why do we have lower life expectancy, higher infant mortality, and higher rates of preventable deaths than countries with government-run healthcare systems? Shapiro opened his mouth, then closed it. For the first time in his career, he seemed genuinely at a loss for words. I'll tell you why, Crockett continued, because our system isn't designed to keep people healthy. It's designed to generate profits for insurance companies, pharmaceutical companies, and hospital corporations. And people like you provide intellectual cover for that system by confusing complexity with wisdom, speed with intelligence, and privilege with expertise. She returned to her podium and closed her portfolio. Ben, you're not a healthcare policy expert. You're a performance artist who's learned to speak quickly and confidently about subjects you don't really understand. And tonight, in front of all these students, you've been exposed as exactly that. The audience sat in stunned silence for a moment, then erupted in applause. Not polite academic applause, but genuine, sustained clapping that went on for nearly a minute. Shapiro sat frozen in his chair, his face pale, his usual smirk completely gone. When the applause finally died down, the moderator tried to continue with the structured debate format, but it was pointless. Shapiro's responses were halting, defensive, completely lacking his usual confidence. During the audience Q&A, student after student asked variations of Crockett's original question about deductibles, about personal experience with healthcare costs, about the disconnect between his policy positions and the reality most people faced. Shapiro's answers became increasingly evasive, increasingly desperate. The final question came from a pre-med student who asked, Mr. Shapiro, after listening to tonight's discussion, do you think maybe you should learn more about healthcare policy before continuing to debate it publicly? Shapiro's response was barely audible. I think we all have more to learn. Within hours, clips of the debate were spreading across social media. But unlike Shapiro's usual viral moments, these clips didn't make him look smart or authoritative. They showed him being systematically dismantled by someone who actually understood the subject matter. The moment when Crockett asked about his deductible was shared millions of times, becoming a perfect example of how privilege blinds people to the realities others face. The phrase, "What's your deductible?" became a meme used to challenge other pundits who made policy arguments without understanding their real-world impact. The response from Shapiro's usual supporters was telling. Instead of defending his arguments, many began questioning whether he really understood the topics he spoke about so confidently. His subscriber numbers began declining for the first time in years. Speaking engagements were canceled. The aura of intellectual authority he'd spent years building crumbled in a single evening. Media critics began analyzing Shapiro's debate style, pointing out how his rapid-fire delivery was designed to prevent real scrutiny of his arguments. Academic experts started fact-checking his previous statements, finding patterns of misleading statistics and logical fallacies masked by confident presentation. The debate had exposed something deeper than just one person's ignorance about healthcare policy. It had shown how much of political discourse was dominated by people who confused performance with expertise, who used their platforms to speak authoritatively about subjects they'd never actually studied or experienced. Crockett's approach, asking simple, direct questions that cut through the noise, became a model for how to handle bad faith debaters. Students across the country began using her techniques in their own discussions, focusing on practical experience and real-world consequences rather than abstract theories. 6 months later, Shapiro's influence had waned significantly. His media company struggled to maintain audience engagement. Universities stopped inviting him to speak. The man who'd built his career on destroying liberals with facts and logic had been destroyed by an actual expert using actual facts and actual logic. In her first interview after the UCLA debate, Crockett was asked what she'd hoped to accomplish. "I wanted to show students what real policy expertise looks like," she said. Ben represents this toxic trend of people who think speaking quickly and confidently makes them smart. But real intelligence means understanding complexity, acknowledging uncertainty, and connecting abstract ideas to concrete human experiences. She paused. The question about his deductible wasn't meant to embarrass him personally. It was meant to illustrate how divorced his policy positions are from the reality most Americans face. If you're going to make arguments about healthcare, you should at least understand how healthcare actually works for ordinary people. The lesson was clear: in an age of social media, an instant fact-checking performance can't substitute for expertise indefinitely. And when someone with real knowledge confronts someone who's been coasting on rhetoric and reputation, the truth has a way of cutting through years of carefully constructed mythology. Ben Shapiro thought he could debate Jasmine Crockett using his usual tactics of rapid-fire talking points and intellectual intimidation. Instead, she exposed him as someone who'd confused speaking quickly with thinking clearly, who'd mistaken confidence for competence, and who'd built a career on providing simple answers to complex problems he'd never actually studied. The single question that left him speechless, "What's your deductible?" became a perfect example of how real expertise differs from performed intelligence. And in a world where authenticity and actual knowledge matter more than ever, that difference proved to be the end of Ben Shapiro's reputation as a serious thinker.